Live on tape, Work in Progress, a World at Work podcast about work, life, and everything in between. With award-winning radio host Tom Alexander and WorkSpan's Not Safe for Work columnist Charles Epstein. Here are your hosts, Tom and Charles.
And welcome to Work in Progress. My name is Tom Alexander, along, of course, with my partner and good friend, Charles Epstein. Hey, Charles.
Hey, Tom. I want to ask you, are you an ebook reader, or do you still stick to actual books with pages that turn?
You know, most of my reading is done digitally, I think, these days, save a couple, maybe a stopover in the bathroom. You know, I'll have some things stacked up and, I'll page through some things without too much information. You know, that's about it these days, I have to say.
Yeah, it's funny. Speaking of bathroom reading, a buddy of mine, as a joke, had Finnegan's Wake in the head. I always thought that was pretty funny. Yeah, let's dip into a little Finnegan's Wake while we're taking care of our business. I tell you, I never thought I'd make the transition from writing on a legal pad to composing on a computer. Now I can barely sign my name. I'm sorry to say that all the money my parents invested in my penmanship have been wasted.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. My mom had enviable penmanship, really, really just beautiful, like something you'd see in a movie. Like you'd see a letter in a movie and it was always written so beautifully. She had that level of penmanship. I myself, not so great, although I prided myself in my printing. I don't know if that counts.
Not really.
Yeah, okay.
But moving right along.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to be a pretty avid book collector. For a while, I worked on the same block as the Strand in downtown New York. I'd spend just about every lunch break there browsing through the stacks. And I must have, 1,000 books maybe on about 8-9 bookcases. I just enjoyed collecting, and occasionally actually reading the things. I actually once had a friend, a real book nut, come over to organize all the books. But after several moves, finally down here in South Florida, I don't think he'd recognize his work, sadly to say. But every so often I'll crack open an actual book. Sometimes a book isn't available as an ebook, so I reserve it from the library, or a book will catch my eye and I'll take it down off the shelf. But, these days I'm about 90 to 95% ebooks and have all these, it's just a ridiculous amount swimming around on my tablet and, various storage devices. Anyway, I was thinking of this in part because I did come across a book the other day, and I just pulled it off the bookshelf. It was kind of random. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Ellison. I just randomly opened to page 50 and randomly selected a passage, and I immediately said, this would be perfect for the podcast. So if you'll indulge me.
Oh, please. Should I play some music? Should we have some music behind you, or?
Yes. I think that would be appropriate. You know what? I'm not sure. I'll leave it to you to select the appropriate music. I know that you usually have a very deft hand with that stuff, so I know it's going to be appropriate.
Read on, McDuff.
Thank you, sir. Anyway, here we go. He's talking about in his passage about these rites of initiation called fool's errands. Quote, "When I played hooky for the first time and went to water the elephants of the Ringling Brothers Circus in Oklahoma City, I was sent on such an errand. The circus workers told me to go to a certain man and bring back the quote-unquote tent wrench. Well, after I had exhausted myself traveling around the circus grounds, I learned that there was no such thing as a tent wrench." And, Ellison goes on to talk about the deeper significance. It's not just a rite of initiation. There's something deeper. Anyway, can you remember being on a new job and, sent on a fool's errand, told to do something that was obviously just a goof to make you look foolish, or some initiation? Could you offhand think of anything?
Yeah, I kind of think of these things as like pledging a fraternity, right? A little bit.
Well, yeah, part of it. Well, I think it's sort of, it can be that. Doesn't necessarily have to be that. I think,
Yeah.
the hazing element is obviously there's a little bit
Right.
more sadistic glee going into it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's pretty wild. I think sometimes like ball players, the hot foot for the rookie, right?
Sure, sure.
But no, I do remember. Although I gotta say it was interesting. It wasn't exactly timed on my way in, but on the exit of a coworker who I can say that he and I did not hit it off. Let's put it that way. And so he set me up with a prank task. I did not know he was leaving the company, and he set me up with this unbelievable, deadline intensive task that was a complete fake, a complete farce. And so I'm doing all this work and making phone calls and going crazy, and finally I found out later that it was the fakeroo. And I managed to get him on the phone, and he and I went around and around on that, and that was that was quite intense.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I think that was pretty slick.
Oh, brilliant on his part. I'm still trying to figure out how to get back at him.
Yeah, well, one of these days, maybe we'll put our heads together. We'll come up something appropriately hellish.
That would be great.
Thank you. I have an initiation story, but I actually came across something that's better. I was reading about a commodities trader who had a group of young energy traders plunge into the icy waters of the Hudson in New York because they lost a game of Texas Hold'em. So, some of the traders came prepared. This is, they were going to take their punishment, but some came prepared, wearing professional wetsuits. One came dressed, like it was a normal business day. He knew he was going to take the plunge, but he was dressed, down to his Gucci loafers, worn, of course, without socks.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So, it was kind of interesting because, part of this is initiation, but it does sort of edge over into a kind of hazing. Though I tell you, the Gucci loafers guy clearly had it coming. I know you agree with that.
No question.
No
Yeah,
question.
definitely
No
agree with
question.
that.
No question. Anyway, but the trader who staged it was pretty clever. How you took your punishment said, a lot about you. Is basically sizing them up. So the traders, who were wearing the wetsuits was seen as cunning. One trader who took the plunge shirtless was seen as fearless. And the one with the designer shoes, I kind of see him as a fool with too much disposable income. But apparently he was viewed as an admirable stoic. I guess these are all qualities you want in a trader, given the intense pressure in the trading pits. But that is kind of extreme.
Yeah, I can remember like Philly on a gig there. I was working dead of winter and stepped ankle deep into a freezing puddle, but I wasn't wearing Gucci loafers. And I was definitely not sockless, but thanks for sharing that. I remember years ago, a couple of guys I grew up with were raking it in on Wall Street. I wish I knew then what they had to go through. I might have enjoyed that. Though, to be honest, they have to be taking almost daily plunges for 3 months straight for me to feel the scales are anywhere near in balance.
Yes.
But anyway, look, we should move on to really the show at hand here, which is a little bit of a departure for us, right? I mean, it's definitely not exactly a standard garden variety, if you will, work in progress.
No, it's not.
We usually introduce our two guests, and we're unaware of how it's going to go, what they're going to say. You're trying to look into the future, the crystal ball, if you will. Earlier this week, though, we spoke with novelist Andrew Krivak.
Award-winning novelist. Andrew
Yes,
Krivak.
award-winning novelist. He's the author of 2 critically acclaimed novels, one a National Book Award finalist.
I know we're not supposed to play favorites here on Work in Progress. Every guest thus far has had game. I think you'll agree to that. But I have to say our conversation with Andrew was one of our best. I know you agree with that because we were really jazzed after we spoke with him.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really interesting guest. Yeah, such a great story. Studied philosophy, poetry. Suddenly has an idea that he transforms into a novel. It gets recognition and awards. And, Charles, what's interesting is how he describes how he picks his topics and plans his new novels and work, which itself feels like he's, working out a plot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, it was great that he took us into his process, telling us how he weaves, taking care of his kids with his work, and how he's structured his life basically to allow him to pursue this kind of work. It was a perfect work in progress interview, really.
Yeah, indeed. We usually trim our interviews down to about 15 to 20 minutes. Well, we spoke with Andrew for close to 45 minutes, and it was a hard one to edit down, I'd have to say.
Yes.
So long story short, and something of a departure for us, this week's show will feature one guest, our conversation with Andrew Krivak. And we really do think you'll enjoy it.
Oh, yes. But we promise to have 2 interviews next week and into the foreseeable future, unless, of course, Michelle Obama or Bob Dylan wants to spend some time with us. Guys, if you're listening, we promise to give you the full 45 minutes. In fact, we'll just hit record. Stay as long as you like.
Oh, and Danish and refreshments will be served.
How can they resist?
Oh, what other podcast is going to do that for you?
None.
No,
Just here,
none.
work in progress.
No. I mean, you might get stuff better than Danish, but Danish and refreshments, that's strictly, that's our hang.
Yeah, but it's quality Danish and quality refreshments, top shelf stuff.
Yes. On that note, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment with Andrew Krivak. This is Work in Progress. He's Charles Epstein. I'm Tom Alexander. Back in a moment.
Data, the mantra of business today. It's nothing new to World at Work. It's no small feat that they've been collecting data on salary issues for its salary budget survey for more than 45 years. Think about it, 45 years. With close to 7,000 responses, 2019 salary budget survey is packed with insights on base salaries, merit budgets, promotional increases, and variable pay plans. Curious to know how your company stacks up? HR execs in the know rely on World at Work's salary budget survey. Shouldn't you too? Go to worldatwork.org/salary budget survey to learn more.
Have I done enough, Father? Can I rest now? Have I learned enough, Mother? Can we talk now? Will you visit me in my place of peace? I'm going driftless.
Andrew Krivak is an award-winning American novelist known for his novels The Sojourn and The Signal Flame. He's a graduate of St. John's College and the writing program at Columbia University. He earned his PhD from Rutgers University. His anticipated book, The Bear, is due early next year, and he joins us now from his home near Boston, Massachusetts. Hey, Andrew, how are you?
I'm well, Tom. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate this.
Well, it's great to have you, and I'd like to introduce you to my co-host and good friend, Charles Epstein.
Hello, Charles. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Andrew. Thanks for joining us. This is a treat. I believe you are the first novelist we've had as a guest, which is very exciting. Full disclosure, we had wanted to get Philip Roth on, but unfortunately that didn't work out for reasons that are kind of obvious. We started the podcast several months too late. We were then going to try to chase down Don DeLillo and possibly Don Winslow, but you are on a very distinguished list of novelists we wanted to get on this show. So thank you very much. The Sojourn, your first novel, a finalist for the National Book Award, starts in Colorado at the very end of the 19th century. Most of its action takes place in Central Europe in the years before, during, and after World War I. How did the idea come to you?
Yeah. So as I was growing up in Pennsylvania, my grandfather had died before I was born. My grandmother always spoke of the old country, and she spoke about her husband as well. And we all knew that he had fought in World War I on the side of the Austrians against the Italians on the Piave River. He, as all Slovaks were, they were conscripted into the Austrian army. And so I had heard these stories growing up. And after my first book, which was a work of nonfiction, I thought about this story about my grandfather who left his village, fought in the war, captured on the Piave River, sent to prisoner of war in Sardinia, and then walked home to what was then Czechoslovakia in 1919. And I pitched it to my agent as a kind of European non-fictional Cold Mountain. And there was silence on the other end of the line. She said, "It sounds to me like you want to write a novel." And I said, "Well, can I? Because I'm in nonfiction." And she said, "Oh yeah, absolutely. I would love to see you write a novel." So I did. I set out. And initially I thought it would be a big, sprawling epic. But as I chipped away at it, literally chipped away at it, I pared it down and put it in that first person, so that one person was speaking this singular account. And Joseph Vinich is kind of an amalgam of many different stories I heard about men and women from the village where my grandmother and my grandfather both grew up in what's now Slovakia. And so it became this notion of the sojourn as in the brief period of stay between two travels, two periods of travel. And so that was my grandfather's, part of his sojourn in the old country. He was born there, but my grandmother was born in America, went back to the old country, and then came back to America as a citizen in about 1919. So those are the bare bones of it.
And in general, Andrew, the decision-making process in deciding, what you want to write, how long can that take? I mean, and how is the, what is the process? When do you decide, how do you decide, what am I going to write?
Yeah. So someone once told me a long time ago that everyone has a subject. The question is, what's the story? So there's sometimes I start writing when I have a subject and hope that I'll get the arc of a story eventually if I keep at it. Sometimes you just have a story and you sort that out according to how you need to solve the problems of the narrative. The Sojourn, once I conceived of it as this novel about a man who leaves a village, fights in a war, survives, and goes back to this country where he was born in, had the storyline in it the whole time. So I got lucky, and that was in that I had the story first. And then it was a question of how do I then present it on the page. But, I think it's all about the process, if you will, the habit of finding your writing time and every day putting something on the page. And then it changes. It's like having a lump of clay on the table and you're carving out what you think will be the face that you want, but ultimately you find the face that you need to carve, if that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
The Sojourn took me quite a while to write, as did the Signal Flame. Signal Flame, I was not so clear on the story at first. So that took me a lot of time, several iterations. I can safely say that I've never written a book that did not take me at least 3 full iterations.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Christopher Hitchens once said, yes, everyone has a novel in them, and in most cases, that's where it should remain. But so to your point, every day, I'm assuming you write every day or mostly every day. Do you log the number of words you write, or is that not part of your process? I used to be a very big fan, still kind of am, of the Parish Review interviews. You ever read any of those interviews where it's writers interviewing other writers about the process of writing? And one of those interviews, famously, Hemingway let you know how he started his process. I think it was something like he'd sharpen 8 number 2 pencils. And I think that was the first time, we learned that he had a desk where he would write standing up often. And he would log his words. And a lot of writers novelists particularly, log the amount of words each day. Do you have any process like that?
I don't, because I'm a father of 3 children, and from when they were very young to now, that what my oldest is a teenager, I can never guarantee that I would be able to sit long enough to log, say, 100 words or 10 words. But for me, what I realized over time was that the process of showing up was what was most important. I do, however, have something that I start with. It's not the sort of similar to the sharpening of pencils, and it comes from Joan Didion, which may be from her an interview with her as well. I always read back over what I'd written the day before. That reorients me on the page, and I realize too what's rubbish and what's worth keeping. And I'm always shocked to find both, that I keep something I thought I would get rid of, and something I thought was really good just disappears. I also feel like that's a process that creates a great deal of what I would call like leitmotifs, or an elusive character to not elusive but elusive, an elusive character to those stories, where I start to feel things pinging in the middle of a story that I had put down in the beginning, and it just all of a sudden carries a life with it into the text that I hadn't anticipated. But it's because I'm continually aware of that by the rereading process. I'm a reader. I just read all the time. When I can't write, I just grab a book and I read. And I consider that writing time as well, just being in touch with words.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because anybody who tells me they're a writer, the first question I ask is, what do you read?
What do you read? Exactly.
What do you read, right? So who are your influences? It's interesting you say that. I think your first book was a nonfiction, and obviously your next two are fiction. So it sounds like you didn't start out with the idea of being a novelist. Maybe you did, but who are your influences before you came to write this? And maybe these 2 books had specific influences as you were writing them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first of all, I started out reading philosophy at St. John's College. You know, it was just literature for me. So that deep immersion in books, everything from the Iliad and the Odyssey to Joyce's Dubliners and Faulkner's The Bear in our senior year. So that desire to read and to sit with a story for a long time, I think is critical. I started out writing poetry, and that's what my degree from Columbia was, in the writing program there. I was a poet, and I wanted to be a poet. So I read a lot of the contemporary Americans from the post-war period, after the modernists, Lowell, Berryman, Elizabeth Bishop. I just love these guys. And there's a poet named Larry Levis, who died in the 90s. Fantastic poet. I would just pick up Levis any time of the day, read his poetry, and have it be like a meal for me. But with respect to novelists, you know, I began to read Cormac McCarthy, and I remember reading All the Pretty Horses for the first time and thinking, wow, this is something that's language and literature. Blood Meridian, I think, is the greatest novel of the 20th century. I mentioned Faulkner, that I read as an undergrad. Marilyn Robinson currently is one of my great favorites. And it's what I'm attracted to are writers who are practitioners of the craft. I really want to read good language and a taut understanding of what a sentence is. Tim O'Brien, you know, I met him out in Dayton, Ohio, around the time the Sojourn was received the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction, and he always says, I don't write stories, I write sentences. And I feel like the writers I love, they write sentences, and that's what I look for and drawn to.
Right. Well, certainly Joyce and Faulkner fit that description. You know, speaking of this,
especially long.
Yes, it's funny. When I mentioned Hemingway, you mentioned Faulkner. I think it was Hemingway who said the difference between the two of them was that he was a taker outer, Faulkner was a putter inner. Pretty good.
I do remember reading A Farewell to Arms early on, you know, probably in high school, and reading it, you know, subsequently, like every other year, I would pick up A Farewell to Arms, and I have to say that the Sojourn definitely owes a great deal to Farewell to Arms from Hemingway.
Yeah. I thought that. I was reading it. You know, Andrew, I thought it was really, really interesting. In your first book, you have the father and son. They're only speaking English as they one day long to emigrate to the U.S., and they're reading all these American books. Among them, the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. I just thought that was a fascinating and very apt choice, having read Chernow's book on Grant. I came to appreciate contra the myths and legends about him, the man's integrity, his intelligence, and even his literary talent. I mean, you read the excerpts from the battlefield, and they're extraordinary, as, of course, is his memoir. I'm curious, why did you single out Grant's memoirs? I thought that was such an inspired choice.
Yeah, great question. I'll tell you why. It's very practical. I did my PhD, as Tom mentioned at the outset, at Rutgers in English literature and modernism, and I happened to find a cache of letters by William Carlos Williams to his brother, which had been sealed up at the University of Pennsylvania since 1965. And so I just started reading them, and in this very private discourse emerged this very public discourse about modernism emerging in America. So, boom, that became my dissertation. But Williams loved all of these books that are just lost to history from the late 19th, early 20th century. And one of them is the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. And so, as you have to do when you're doing your doctoral studies, I went and read the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, so that when it came time to populate Andrei Vinich's library there in that cabin in Slovakia, I was thinking, okay, what books would make it across the ocean to this man's hut up in the Carpathian Mountains? And I put Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs in there. That's where it comes from. The letters of William Carlos Williams.
Interesting.
Wow. Your second book, The Signal Flame, picks up the story of the Vinich family. And the first arrival, Joseph comes to America after surviving World War I as a conscript. He arrived with $50, made his way to the small town of Darden, Pennsylvania. The novelist set in the United States, but it explores the legacies of the wars in Vietnam, in Europe, war being the dominant theme in both novels. Two questions. Why did you make it so central to both narratives and such a driving force as you chart the progress of several generations of the Vinich family? And then I'll ask my follow-up.
As a boy growing up in Pennsylvania, I knew my grandfathers were in World War I. Those are the first stories I heard. I knew my father was in World War II, and my brother was just about to leave for Vietnam if his draft number came up. And so in the course of listening to stories about the past, I just assumed that as a boy becoming a young man, I would have my own war to fight one day. Never happened, but that notion of the generations of the men at war has always stuck with me. And so when I began writing the story of Joseph Vinich and explored World War I, there were some editors who said, why isn't this some big, epic, sprawling piece? And I knew that it wouldn't be, that it shouldn't be. But I did think, well, there's still the question of the generations at war. And so The Signal Flame became an exploration of that from now the place of fictional Darden, Pennsylvania. And then to connect the two, if you remember that the Sojourn is actually spoken in March of 1972 by an older Joseph Vinich about his time, about his coming of age. And if you were to read it straight through, it would take about the time roughly from 5 o'clock in the evening till about just after midnight, given a few minutes to take a break. I wanted that performative aspect of the novel. So with The Signal Flame, what you do is you find out why Joseph Vinich was speaking that story, why he was unburdening himself of that past, of that coming of age. And it's to his grandson, Bo Connor, in the Signal Flame, because Bo's brother and Joseph Vinich's other grandson, Sam Connor, has been reported missing in action in Vietnam. So that period of The Signal Flame is essentially the April of 1972, just after Joseph Vinich has passed away, to Christmas of 1972. So in that kind of cycle from spring into the next winter, I wanted to explore those cycles of time. The specific one really it's a liturgical cycle, that April to December, but then also the stretch of the linear stretch of times from one war to the next.
Andrew, you're such a lyrical writer, and yet you're writing about something so unspeakably horrific. War, obviously. It seems there's a natural tension there, and I'm not sure you're not looking to glamorize war, any aspects of it. So how do you reconcile this inherent tension?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think I've, in my own coming of age as a reader and as a scholar, I've looked at the other writers who've done this as well. Tolstoy, McCarthy, Faulkner, Hemingway. There's something about what they did as well, trying to understand what's human within that inhuman. And let me see, I'm struggling with the question in this way, is that I've never known war. I'm lucky to say that I'm a lover, not a fighter, and and I've known men who are fighters, and I've respected them from a distance, and but respect is the operative word there. So I think how I balance it is going back to what I learned from the ancient Greeks at St. John's College, is that struggle persists. We are struggle. Story is about struggle. What the Greeks called the agon. Every tragedy, every comedy has an antagonist and a protagonist. And so while initially I was thinking about story in that way, I realized that what I was given, while I was making a story, the content I was given and would use was the story of war from my grandfathers, my own father, and so I thought, okay, can I do this not having seen a fight, not having been in a war, and so that's why the Sojourn emerges in that way. And the other thing is too, I have witnessed struggle within nature. I'm fascinated by the battle, if you will, of nature. And so that sense of wanting to be a lyrical poet on the page who also is documenting someone's an other struggle within the field of the battlefield of humans at war. They just came together for me, and I was mostly like can I do this? Can I pull this together and pull it off? I mean, it remains to be seen whether that latter is true, but I've just been fascinated by it. And the Signal Flame is sort of my attempt to have war be off stage. Everything about Vietnam is other in another place. But Bohemir Connor struggles nevertheless. Everyone in that book struggles with their own sort of internal conflict.
We'll continue with part 2 of our conversation with American author Andrew Krivak right after these words. What to do when you need external HR expertise? Head on over to World at Work's vendor directory, kind of like the Yelp of HR, but without the biases. It's where to turn when you're looking for resources and providers in the world of HR, from legal services to compensation management to loyalty programs to exec comp to relocation services and so much more. You'll find pros in the vendor directory, a seemingly endless reserve of vetted, trusted HR providers. Visit worldatwork.org and take a look. We now return to part 2 of our conversation with American author Andrew Krivak.
While Vietnam and war may be sort of off stage, what's not off stage, are the interest in guns, particularly hunting, which is so much a part of the family ethos. In the Signal Flame, you have one hunting scene between old Joseph and young Bo. That to me, we already talked about Hemingway and Cormac McCarthy, but to me, this was just really captures what you're going after and how you reconcile what Tom was asking, the lyrical with the unspeakable. But this particular passage, to me, it just combined the earthy specificity of Hemingway and the lyricism of McCarthy. Would you have that passage handy? Maybe you can share that with our listeners, because I just think that's a beautiful passage. It really gets at this.
Do you mean at the very beginning of the Signal Flame?
Yes.
So Bo is while at his grandfather's coffin. He's being waked inside the house, and he sort of falls asleep in the evening. You stay with the body, and he has this waking dream about when he's goes hunting with Joseph for the first time, and his grandfather tells him, we're gonna get up early tomorrow. We're gonna go hunting, and he says, it's time you came with me. Joseph is after what's called a deer killer. And Tom, you may know this. Tom and I both, the part of Pennsylvania where we grew up, there was a lot of hunting. My father had firearms. He was a hunter. I had my own shotgun at the age of 13. I never really hunted much. I didn't like it much. But deer killers were dogs who chased deer and killed them, ate them. And any deer hunter would tell you that if he or she saw a dog chasing a deer, they would shoot the dog. So that's the context of this, of this Pennsylvania in this case, it's in the 60s. They came through the trees to the edge of the open field where a silver horizon met silver grass bent down with frost and spread out flat before them. A farmhouse and barn stood at the distant edge of that field, and Bo wanted to ask who lived there, but he did not. His grandfather sat down on a large rock and levered a singled around into the marlin. Bo sat down next to him and moved his hands and feet to keep warm. They waited a long time until the sun was bright and round above the horizon in the east, when his grandfather put a finger to his lips and pointed in the direction of where a doe had emerged from the trees. He slipped off his mittens, got down on one knee, and brought the rifle to his shoulder. Bo followed the sight line of the barrel and saw that it was aimed not at a doe, but at the low-slung figure of a dog, like no dog he'd ever seen, sleek and hunched and twitching at the far end of the field. He looked at his grandfather, as frozen as the grass, and back at the dog just as it leaped. The rifle cracked and the animal arced back in one round motion, and then Bo felt his bowels loosen. The warmth spreading around him where he sat, he stood up fast, dropped his .22, and ran. So he's afraid then afterwards that Joseph, he failed as a hunter, and Joseph will never take him hunting again, and he runs a long way home and then falls down in this grass. And Joseph shows up and he says, "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." And that's sort of, Joseph understands that it's both Joseph, the great sharpshooter from the Sojourn, who comes to America, and that's why he's so good with hunting with firearms. But he knows that Bo's not cut out for it. Sam, of course, will be cut out for it. But he's, in that sense, Joseph becomes the man who is the lyrical, who understands his grandson, but also understands that his grandson is one of those guys who will not partake in the unspeakable, in the killing of things or people.
That's a really good passage, and I think that does capture the heart of this idea of reconciling, the lyrical, the unspeakable. I'm calling it the unspeakable. You can call it any number of things, but I think that's what you do so beautifully in both novels.
Yeah, Bo does hunt. He shoots the turkey for Thanksgiving, and he even shoots a hawk who's killed one of his mother's chickens. Yeah.
Mm. Tell us a little bit. I know The Bear is coming out early next year, but what are you working on currently? Is there a project that you're at work on now?
I am. So The Bear is a sideline. Well, I shouldn't say sideline. It's a detour for me. The Bear is a short novel, which is about a man and his daughter, and they're the last two humans left on Earth. And it occurs at a time when the veil between nature and humans is lifted. There's no post-apocalyptic simmering and smoking Earth. The Earth has actually returned to a sort of Eden-like state. I flipped Genesis, the creation story, on its head. But it's about the coming of age of this girl. And I wanted to write about nature and get to it as really explore the beauty of nature, and kind of ask the question of how hubristic are we as we seemingly move away from our understanding of nature and let things happen to this earth that will have dire consequences. So it's a book that is about the extinction of the human species, but which ends on a note of hope, if that's possible. I had to write that. For some reason, I was telling my kids all these stories about Pennsylvania and bears and growing up, and it sort of clicked something in me, and I wanted to just try to exercise this type of novel. And I got it out, and Erica Goldman at Bellevue really wanted to publish it, so that's who's putting it out in February. And I'm really pleased with it. I'm glad I took that direction.
Any debt to McCarthy's The Road in that book?
No,
seems like there's some distant echoes. No? Okay.
Well, of course I've read The Road. Yeah. But The Road is populated with much of the unspeakable. It's really. I still find The Road difficult to read. Yeah, exactly. But no, The Bear is the complete opposite.
Okay.
in that sense. And even though, the road is not about the end of things, it's about the dramatic moment where things have changed so completely. But no, I certainly had the road in mind when I was
Okay,
writing,
great. And when will this be out?
Wanting it not to be there. This will be out in February 11th, 2020.
Oh, wow.
But now I've currently gone back to the third volume of the Darden trilogy, a novel I'm calling Like the Appearance of Horses. And it's another stretch of time, and it fills in the gaps of other characters from the Signal Flame, whom I was not able to give time to give voice to in that period of time in 1972 from April to December. So they get a chance to speak, and all of the stories fill in this final volume of the Darden trilogy. That's the next book.
Right, so the next time we have you on, we're going to have to ask you how you'd cast the trilogy. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think, I've always wondered about, I've read Harry Potter to my kids. Did J.K. Rowling really know what she was doing in the Sorcerer's Stone so that she would link it up in Deathly Hallows? I don't think so. But there are ways in which stories lend themselves to opening as you write them. When you say something, it's closed, right? It's done. You can't go back and change a book. But that's not to say that other possibilities haven't opened based on what you've already laid in stone, and that's what I'm working with now.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned the Bear due out February 11th on 2020, which is my partner's birthday.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so that's a good birthday present, Charles.
It is, and exactly. Both of you guys now know what to get me. An autographed copy of that book, which I'll be expecting. So thank you very much, and I'm very impressed, Tom. That you know my birthday. I don't know the birthday of my mother, my father, my sister, my significant other. I know the birthday of my daughter, but for some reason, I don't know.
Well, I've always had an odd proclivity for license plates, phone numbers, and birthdays. Don't ask me why. I just and home addresses, it's just one of that weird little thing in my mind that somehow retains that information. I think I guess it has to be connected to my love of baseball statistics or something like that. But anyway, I know you had one more question, Charles.
Yeah, recently the Irish novelist Adrian McGinty got a lot of attention as an Uber driver, whose latest novel, The Chain, became a surprise international bestseller, and he landed a 7-figure movie deal. What's interesting about that, I've been a long-time McGinty fan. His Sean Duffy novels are terrific, and they've all been, well, at least most of them, have been well received critically. So I was very surprised to learn that before writing The Chain, he became an Uber driver to make ends meet. He and his family of 4 were evicted from their home, and he was virtually penniless. It shocked me, particularly when talking about such an accomplished novelist. It made me realize how tough it is these days, particularly these days, making it as a novelist, even a critically acclaimed one. Could you speak to that, the working life of a novelist, what it is like these days as opposed to maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Yeah, I could try. I mean, having gotten a PhD, I imagined that I would be an academic, that I would teach English at a college or university and write on the side and, put out my books of poetry, etc. And it was when I finished my PhD and my wife and I moved to England. She's a management consultant, and she was doing her MBA at Cambridge University in England. And there was no chance I could get into the job market in England. So I started writing, and we lived in England for 5 years, and I didn't get a teaching job. When I came back to the U.S., I was in the adjunct teaching position, all of which is to say that it's really hard to write if you're not attached to an institution. I was finding it really hard to write while I was attached to an institution and then the father of 3 kids. And so my wife and I decided I would just stop teaching and just focus on the kids and be the sort of, stay-at-home dad, which was remarkably freeing both for me mentally and also, too, as a writer. Their demands were great, so I'm really the father first. But I think that, it's really a kind of 1% who can write all the time because they're set in the market. Editors and publishing houses are constantly looking for that 1%, the person who brings back a huge return on investment. So, folks who don't never know which house they're going to go to from one book to the next, or if they'll even get a book published. To me, if an editor wants me to sign a contract, I think it's fantastic. I really always feel lucky when someone says, yes, we'll publish this book. So I think, you still have to be doing something else. My wife and I have a good balance, so that my something else is raising the kids. But, I've taken them all over the place. I've taken them to read at the Slovak embassy. I've taken them to Dayton, Ohio. I've taken them to Chautauqua, New York. Because if my wife's traveling and I've got a gig, I buy plane tickets for the kids. And that's just the way it is. It's really hard. It is hard. But it's also exciting. And, that drive to just keep writing, to create, other novelists and poet friends of mine, the final refrain in all this is, I get to do this. And if you had told me, 20 years ago, 30 years ago that I would get to do this, I'd say you're crazy. So I'm pretty happy doing it the way I do it now. As Richard Gere says in An Officer and a Gentleman, I got nowhere else to go.
That's great. Andrew, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This has been just wonderful. I know I can speak for Charles when I say we both really, really enjoy and appreciate this time with you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it too. Yeah, thanks for having me on, and thanks. And thanks for being a reader. Boy, there's nothing I'm grateful for more. Yeah,
well, we are really looking forward to The Bear, and we'll love to have you on again for sure. Andrew Krivak is an award-winning American novelist known for his novels The Sojourn and The Signal Flame, and his new book, The Bear, due out in February of 2020. He joined us from his home near Boston. We'll be back right after these words.
Have I done enough, Father? Can I rest now? Have I learned enough, Mother? Can we talk now? Will you visit me in my place of peace? I'm going driftless.
Data, the mantra of business today. It's nothing new to World at Work. It's no small feat that they've been collecting data on salary issues for its salary budget survey for more than 45 years. Think about it, 45 years. With close to 7,000 responses, 2019 Salary Budget Survey is packed with insights on base salaries, merit budgets, promotional increases, and variable pay plans. Curious to know how your company stacks up? HR execs in the know rely on World at Work's Salary Budget Survey. Shouldn't you too? Go to worldatwork.org/salary budget survey to learn more.
Now back to Work in Progress with your hosts, Tom Alexander and Charles Epstein.
Wrapping things up now on Work in Progress, along with Charles Epstein, I'm Tom Alexander.
Great interview. It was really, really great spending time with Andrew. And by the way, I recommend anybody go to Amazon or wherever you get your books, go to the library, grab his two novels because they really, really are terrific. And I hope we can coax Andrew or his publisher actually to do a reading down here. There's a great Barnes & Noble by me. I think he'd get a great crowd. And, as a poet, he's probably a very good reader. I mean, he gave us that one passage, but I'm sure up in front of a crowd because, that background really lends itself to that, to be able to get up there and give a really good reading.
Yeah, no doubt. And of course, you like a musician might, you feed off the energy of the room, right? I would think somebody that reads like that would really be inspired.
Oh, yeah. And again, unlike, say, a novelist or another type of writer, a poet is usually experienced at getting up in front of people because poetry, I think, is often written not so much for the page, but to be spoken out loud. So, yeah, I can imagine he'd be a terrific presenter. And I tell you, talking about Adrian McGinty, I thought his response to that and how, he's balanced his writing, taking care of his kids. His wife is out there doing her thing. Yeah, it's just kind of very interesting, some of those parallels. But I tell you, Andrew needs a movie deal, man. Those two novels, he's going to be working on a third after he brings out The Bear in the fall, in the winter, February 11th, my birthday. How can we forget? It's already, his two novels, and apparently he's picking those up, filling in some gaps, as he said. He's just got epic sweep, and, war is always highly cinematic, though, much of it, I'm sure, as in his novels, will probably be off screen, some great characters. Family drama. I'm seeing this as a 5-part Netflix movie or series, Tom.
Yeah, wow, that would be great. Hey, listen, as long as I get a shot to score it, that would be.
I
would love that.
I'll put in a good word for you.
Please, please do.
Yes.
We spoke with him for close to an hour, 45, 50 minutes or so, longer than that maybe. We could have kept him for a lot more. But, you have to make tough choices. For instance, we could have kept this in, but after careful consideration, we decided not to. And I'd like to introduce you to my co-host and good friend, Charles Epstein.
Hello, Charles. How are you today?
That would be your cue, Charles.
Well, I thought, Andrew, it's funny. I don't want to get into this, but, it's obviously going to be edited and so forth. But, we do this all the time. Okay, guest, I'm now going to introduce you to my partner and good friend, Charles Epstein. We always thought that was a cue for the guest, but no guest has ever taken that cue. It's the weirdest thing. It's the weirdest thing.
And let's not forget this gripping exchange that unfortunately didn't make the cut. Charles? Did we lose you?
I'm sorry. I put myself on mute because there was some ambient noise. I apologize. The desperation in your voice, thinking I'd abandon you, that was actually quite touching, Tom.
Yes. Well, Charles, as you may know, I do have abandonment issues. So, yes, thanks. At the time, I just wanted to know where the hell you were. You're here now, Charles, and really at the end, I think that's all that counts.
Again, very, very sweet. That's really tugging at the heartstrings.
When I say you're here, it means we're live on tape.
Oh, naturally.
Yes. And speaking of live on tape, it's time to edit this show and figure out just what the heck we're going to put in it.
Does that go into the blooper reel?
I think that goes into the blooper reel too. No, I think we'll leave that in. That's a human moment there. We'll figure it out, folks. For Charles Epstein, my name is Tom Alexander. This is Work in Progress. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next time. So long, everybody.
This has been Work in Progress, a World at Work podcast about work, life, and everything in between, with award-winning radio host Tom Alexander and WorkSpan's Not Safe for Work columnist Charles Epstein. For more, visit worldatwork.org/work-in-progress. That's worldatwork.org/work-in-progress. Join us next week for another edition of Work in Progress.